Most people here, at least I hope so, are going to recognize the name Dan Rather. There's a story one time. Dan Rather pulls into a Florida city, and he's in a large Florida hotel for some conference or other, and he comes in late at night, and he gets up in the morning, and he's kind of grumpy. And after flown in late, you know how you feel? You just feel a little bit strung out and kind of dried out. Flying dries you out, and you're just not always in the best of moods. And he was up early the next morning to go downstairs and make a speech before several thousand people. And he was really, that day, in no mood whatsoever to be the center of attention. Yet in the elevator, he felt that all eyes were turned on him because he was, after all, Dan Rather. And he thought to himself as the elevator descends to the lobby, he says, you know, didn't these people's mothers teach them that it is rude to stare? And they get down to the lobby, and the elevator door opens, and as it begins to empty, there's a very meek woman in the corner. She gently takes his sleeve, and she says, "Excuse me, Mr. Rather, I don't mean to intrude." And she looks around, and she makes sure that the elevator now is truly empty, and no one else is listening. She says, "I don't want this to be embarrassing, but your fly is unzipped, and a piece of your shirt tail is sticking through it." And she smiled and walked off the elevator, leaving the great Dan Rather to tidy himself up. You know, Samaritans, they come in all shapes and sizes, don't they? People who offer us help in our lives in timely fashion and in ways that we could never imagine. They come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, the gospel, Jesus tells this story to a man who's wanting to justify himself. This man is looking for a reason to deny this to somebody else. You have to understand the mindset here. He understood the law, and the law, of course, is what we read the first lesson, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the 5 books of the law. This man understood these, and he knew the answers. But what Jesus was asking for was something more. And when the man gave him the right answer, then Jesus told the story of the Samaritan. And of course you have the priest and the Levite, who were the acceptable people, but they're not the ones that help. There was this Samaritan person that actually goes out of his way, and I mean really out of his way, to offer help to this man who's been essentially mugged and left for dead on the side of the road. You need to understand one thing about this story. The Samaritan was the least likely out of a lineup of the usual suspects. The Samaritan would have been the least likely person that one would have guessed would have rendered this help. He was, and it's an ugly word, but he was kind of a half-breed. All right? And the religious practices of this people were always suspect because they came from a very different religious background than the Jews, and even though he had some Jewish training, he was never one of the people. You know how that goes, right? You can be a member of a church for 30 years, and you can come nearly every single Sunday, but you're not quite as good a member as the one who'd been there 50 years. You get that? You can live in a town. I mean, go out west. I love to go to Starbuck, Minnesota, and it's really plain who's lived there and who hasn't. And they just know these things. And coming as an outsider from the city, I'm always a little bit suspect. You're not one of us. This was the Samaritan. But Jesus opens his arms wide, figuratively speaking, and he says there is nobody who is outside the grace of God. Did you hear that? There's nobody who is outside of the grace of God. God opens his arms and he accepts everybody in this world. I want you to think for a minute, who would be the least likely person that you would do that for? Open your arms wide. Who is the least likely? And Jesus says, these are the ones whom we must welcome. And as we welcome them, surprise, surprise, look what happens. This man acts from a tremendous base of faith. He uses his own elements to bind this man's wounds. I've been in this part of the world now. That was an eye-opening experience, aside from the fact that it was a war. But you realize that this was the part of the world in which these stories took place. It is pretty sparse. There's lots of sand. There's lots of dirt. Lots of wind. Lots of sunshine. And not much else. So for this Samaritan to do what he did in the middle of this wilderness, using his own stores, it's pretty remarkable. But then he does something that even 21st century Christians can understand and marvel at. He puts the man on his own beast and takes him to the inn. And not just, well, Mr. Innkeeper, see what I've done. Now I expect you to step up to the plate and do your share. No. He gives the man a room and he pays the innkeeper and says, here, this is on my tab. And take care of him. And if you spend more, I'll pay you the rest when I come back through here.